The revelation didn't come to us telling us, this is what you need to do and this is what will provide you the most happiness. We need to try and fall down and get up again. There is no person, or almost no person, who's, conscious and caring, who has not in their life experienced the imposter syndrome. I'm not against fast food, and I'm not against shallow living once in a while, if it's in conjunction with, in addition to, deeply living.
¡Feliz cumpleaños en Defensa Propia! Miren, si hay algo que me ha enseñado este podcast en estos 6 años que estamos cumpliendo esta semana y celebrándolos con este episodio número 300, es que la felicidad no es un destino, es un proceso. ¿Y quién mejor para hablar de esto que el hombre que se ha dedicado a enseñarle al mundo lo que realmente nos hace felices o cómo podemos construir una vida con propósito y por qué a veces la clave no está en evitar el sufrimiento, sino en aprender de él? Miren, hoy tengo el honor de celebrar este momento tan significativo del podcast con Tal Ben-Shahar, creador de los cursos más populares en la historia de la Universidad de Harvard sobre la psicología positiva. Sus clases han cambiado la manera en que miles de personas en el mundo entienden lo que es el bienestar, la felicidad y el éxito. Sus libros han sido traducidos a más de 30 idiomas y sus enseñanzas han traspasado las aulas para convertirse en una guía de herramientas que nos ayudan a vivir con mayor sentido. Tal Ben-Shahar no solo ha estudiado la felicidad, sino que ha dedicado su vida a hacer que la ciencia del bienestar sea accesible para todos. Por eso creó la Academia de los Estudios de la Felicidad Online, donde puedes obtener una certificación en los estudios de la felicidad en este programa que está diseñado para ayudar a personas de diversas profesiones a comprender, aplicar y enseñar los principios de la psicología positiva y el bienestar en su vida personal y profesional. Fíjate que en este episodio hablamos sobre qué significa realmente ser feliz, si la felicidad es externa o viene desde adentro, o cómo se mide, o cómo podemos reentrenar nuestra mente para encontrar más satisfacción en el presente. También conversamos sobre la construcción de la resiliencia, explorando cómo los desafíos, en lugar de frenarnos, pueden ser fundamentales para el crecimiento personal. También hablamos de cómo podemos vivir con mayor profundidad y también hablamos de los mitos sobre la felicidad que nos venden todos los días por ahí. Antes de dejarlos con Tal Ben-Shahar, te quiero invitar a que vengas a ver puras cosas maravillosas. Este fin de semana por primera vez voy a visitar Canadá y te quiero invitar a que vengas a ver esta obra que nos ayuda a enfocarnos en esas cosas sencillas y simples que hacen que nuestra vida sea maravillosa. El 8 de marzo estaré en Montreal y el 9 en Toronto y haré 2 funciones. Los tickets los consigues en mi página web erikadelavega.com, al igual que mi libro Reinventada, que lo puedes conseguir exclusivamente por Amazon. Si quieres hacer la certificación en los estudios de la felicidad con Tal Ben-Shahar online y en español, tienes hasta el 8 de marzo para inscribirte con un código de descuento especial que él mismo nos dejó por nuestro aniversario. Así que dale el enlace que te dejo en la descripción del episodio y utiliza el código 600DLB para que obtengas $600 de descuento. Miren, no podría imaginar un mejor invitado para este episodio especial. 300 conversaciones después, confirmo que la felicidad, como todo en la vida, se aprende. Ahora sí te voy a dejar con Tal Ben-Shahar, quien nos recuerda que la felicidad no es el destino, sino el camino que elegimos recorrer todos los días. En Defensa Propia. En Defensa Propia es presentado por el Guitar Hotel de Seminole Hard Rock, Paleolife, productos naturales, efectivos y respaldados por la ciencia. Este episodio fue posible gracias al Rental MX y a la Academia de los Estudios de la Felicidad de Tal Ben-Shahar. Welcome, Tal Ben-Shahar, to En Defensa Propia.
Thank you, Erika. It's an honor to be here.
Well, I was wishing to talk to you in the podcast for a long, long time. And well, the things happen when it has to happen. So, Tal, I want to begin because you are an authority on the field of happiness and positive psychology. And my podcast is about reinvention. I want to begin asking you, how was your first reinvention like?
So, very often change comes from desperation.
Yes.
When we experience hardship and difficulty, in my case, it was misery. I was an undergraduate studying computer science at Harvard.
Computer science.
And I found myself in my second year doing very well academically. I was doing very well in sports. I played squash on the Harvard team. I was doing okay socially. And yet I was very unhappy. And, it didn't make sense to me because when I looked at my life from the outside, things looked great. I checked the boxes. But from the inside, it didn't feel that way. And I remember waking up, it was a very cold Boston morning, going to my academic advisor and telling her that I'm switching majors. And she said, what to? And I said, well, I'm switching from computer science to philosophy and psychology. And she said, why? And I said, because I have two questions. First question is, why aren't I happy? Second question, how can I become happier? And it's with these two questions that I then went on to get my undergraduate degree as well as my graduate degrees, all the time focusing on how can I help myself, individuals, couples, families, and organizations increase levels of well-being. And, that was 30 years ago. That's what I've been doing.
And you don't have tools in that time, because today we have a lot of resources so we can use to make changes in our life. And we have a lot of stories so we can, get some inspiration to make those changes in life. But in that time, which resources? Only two questions, but what else?
Yeah. So, this was 1994. The field of positive psychology was only introduced in 1998. So I didn't really have a go-to, but I knew intuitively that philosophers had asked these questions for many years, that religion asked this question, and that, of course, psychologists have been asking questions about well-being. So that's where I went, but I couldn't find a field that coherently put together all the material that was out there. There was a lot of self-help and New Age literature, but these things didn't really work. And I was very fortunate to have mentors. That's another very important element in the path towards a happier or more fulfilled life. Find your mentors. And I was fortunate to find my mentors who literally took me under their wing. And I studied under them, and in many ways I still do.
So that was the tool, like great questions, good mentors.
Yes, and then there was, so what do you actually do? And you know what the first thing that I learned? It was actually that I was looking in the wrong place all along for happiness. Where was I looking for happiness? Where most people look for it, success.
Of course.
And I realized that whether it's getting into a top university or money or prestige and fame, these are just temporary contributors to our happiness. And if we want long-term happiness, sustainable happiness, we have to look elsewhere.
You redefine happiness, Tal, with your work. When do you feel that you have the big definition of happiness that is the foundation of all your work?
Yes, so it was actually gradual. Initially, and this is also my first book, I wrote about happiness as comprising two elements, meaning and pleasure. So for example, if I'm in a relationship and it's pleasurable, we have fun together, but it's not that meaningful. It's great, but it's not happiness. If on the other hand, it's very meaningful for us, maybe we're raising a family together, but we're not really having fun, not pleasurable, that's also not happiness. Or at work. Work can be very meaningful, but not pleasurable. Pleasurable, but not meaningful. When it has both elements, that's happiness. Now, the challenge is not to experience it all the time. No relationship is happy all the time. No workplace just provides you pleasure and meaning 24/7. The challenge is to find, whether it's relationships or work or experiences outside of work, that to a great extent provide you pleasure as well as meaning. But that was just the beginning of my journey. Later, I realized that it wasn't just pleasure and meaning, that happiness actually consists of more than that. And over the past few years, I've come to the conclusion and have been teaching our SPIRE model. And the SPIRE model stands for 5 elements. The S of SPIRE is spiritual well-being. The P of SPIRE is physical well-being. The I is intellectual well-being. The R is relational. And the E, finally, emotional well-being. So these are the elements of a happy life. And once again, you can't have all of them all of the time. But these are good heuristics, good elements to reflect on and think about when you evaluate your life.
But let's remember that it's a kind of funny story, but not for the one who is the person who is living these circumstances. When you decide to create the course of happiness in Harvard, this is a great story because, and you correct me the other day, but because I told you, you had only 6 students. You corrected me like, no, there were 8 of them.
And then 2 dropped out and left me with 6. And it was more than anything, it was such a blow to my ego. What, only 8 arrive and 25% of the class leave?
So what was the genesis? That like the idea, like I'm gonna teach how to be happy. How can people be responsible of their own life? And how I'm gonna teach this thing that it doesn't have any structure.
There are 2 elements that are important to think about. One is, of course, to look at the research out there. And there is very good research, and today a lot more than there was 30 years ago. So look at what are the elements that make us happier. For example, we know that expressing gratitude contributes to happiness. We know that the number one predictor of happiness is spending quality time with people we care about and who care about us. We know that learning is important for happiness. We know that physical exercise matters a lot. So it's looking at the research that's out there and then, of course, implementing it. But even more important than the research is the me search. And the me search is about looking at what's relevant for me in particular. And how do we do me search? We experiment. We try things out. You know, I'm a big believer in biographies. And one of my favorite autobiographies is Mahatma Gandhi's. And his autobiography is titled, My Experiments with Truth. My experiments with truth. It's not my finding truth. It's not the ultimate truth. It's my experiments with truth. In other words, even the great Gandhi experimented, tried things out. And when it comes to our personal happiness or to our success as a manager or as a parent, the key is to try things out, to engage in me search. Because none of us have the exact formula. You know, the revelation didn't come to us telling us, this is what you need to do and this is what will provide you the most happiness. We need to try and fall down and get up again.
How did you manage to believe in yourself during that time? Like, in what way did you stand up for your ideas?
Yeah. So, you know, Erika, the answer to this question is in your question. And that is to stand with your ideas. One of the things that I emphasize to my students, and I tell them, you know, we're studying psychology here. It's about the mind, it's about the heart, it's about the cognitive, the emotional, and yet the most important thing that I'd like you to take away from these lessons is the emphasis on action. So there's no person who does not experience fear and anxiety before doing something that is important and meaningful to them. There is no person, or almost no person, who's, you know, conscious and caring, who has not in their life experienced the imposter syndrome.
Yes.
But so what? So you experience the imposter syndrome. So you're afraid. The key is to act. You know, courage is not about not having fear. Courage is about having fear and going ahead anyway. And when you read the biographies, and this is why I like biographies so much, of the, you know, the honest, the authentic people who write about themselves, they will always say, before I took this step, whether it's Gandhi or Martin Luther King or Helen Keller, before I took this step, I was really afraid. And yet I did it anyway, and I'm so glad I did. And they also write about steps that they took that led to failure and they fell down as a result. But there is no other way. You know, one of the mantras that I repeat to myself, to my kids, to my students, and to my clients is learn to fail or fail to learn.
Yes, that's amazing.
Learn to fail or fail to learn. Because if you look at the most successful people throughout history, and there's a lot of research on this, the most successful people throughout history are also the people who have failed the most, who put themselves on the line time and time again. And as a result of all those failures, they learned and ultimately they succeeded. So experiencing fear, experiencing the imposter syndrome, being concerned and worried, so what? Just do it.
Tal, a lot of people think of happiness as shallow and pain as deep. How can we help them believe that happiness can be as deep as pain?
You know, when the whole field of positive psychology emerged, even the researchers were sure that positive psychology is simply for people who are doing okay to do better. But when you talk about depression or anxiety or other mental illnesses or challenges, that's when you need, you know, the serious psychology, the traditional psychology. But as they started to research positive psychology, which means things like love and strengths and joy and happiness, what they realized that when you cultivate these elements, it also contributes first to overcoming pain, but second to also being more resilient in the face of pain. So for example, if you increase people's levels of happiness, you're also making them more resilient, less likely to fall into addiction, or less likely to experience anxiety or depression.
Mira, si vives en el sur de la Florida o has venido por acá de visita, seguro has visto el Guitar Hotel de Seminole Hard Rock. Es imposible ignorarlo y verlo brillando como si estuviera dando su propio concierto de luces. Pero lo que quizás no sepas es que este no es solo un hotel, es una experiencia de entretenimiento, lujo y comodidad en un solo lugar. Allí tienes habitaciones de lujo, un spa espectacular que te desconecta del mundo y una zona de piscinas y cabañas que te hacen sentir como si estuvieras en un resort tropical. Y si buscas emoción, pues el casino es otra liga. Solo en ese casino encuentras juegos de mesa en vivo, desde blackjack, los dados, la ruleta, y bueno, es pura adrenalina. Y bueno, si lo que quieres es un buen concierto o un show, Hard Rock Live tiene una cartelera increíble. Por ahí han pasado leyendas como The Rolling Stones o Billy Joel. Y próximamente estarán Pearl Jam, Sir Rod Stewart y también Gabriel Fluffy Iglesias. Así que, sea cual sea tu estilo, aquí encuentras entretenimiento para todos los gustos. Y si después de todo eso necesitas un respiro, te recomiendo el Rock Spa, que es un sueño. Tienen 26 tratamientos de lujo que te dejan como nueva. Yo probé el masaje a 4 manos y sinceramente era imposible irme de ahí. De hecho, estoy buscando cómo volver muy pronto. Así que, a ver, si buscas un lugar donde puedes descansar, divertirte, probar suerte y vivir experiencias únicas, el Guitar Hotel de Seminole Hard Rock es el destino. No lo sigas viendo desde la autopista. Ya atrévete a vivirlo.
In other words, it arms you for dealing with life's difficulties. You know, Erika, I have to tell you this. So usually about after a month or two into my college class, a student, or usually more than one student, would come to me and say, Tal, you know, and it's usually the young ones, the 18-year-olds. Tal, you know, I really like positive psychology. In fact, I'm thinking of majoring in psychology and specializing in the science of happiness. But I'm really concerned. And I always ask them, why are you concerned? And they say, well, because what if I become so good at this science of happiness and I learn all the tools that you teach and the techniques, then I'll be so good at it, and then I will no longer experience, you know, hardships and difficulties. And you talk about how important it is to struggle if you want to grow in life. And I always respond in the same way. I always say to them, don't worry. Life will take care of you. Life will always take care of you. So, you know, these hardships and difficulties, they're there. They'll exist. It doesn't matter if you're a professor of happiness or a person just, you know, starting off.
Yeah.
You'll experience them. The difference, though, if you do know about the science of happiness and implement these practices in your life, when these difficulties and hardships emerge, and they will, you'll have more tools in order to deal with them. Your psychological immune system will be stronger. And a strong psychological immune system, or any strong immune system, doesn't mean you don't get sick. It simply means you get sick less often. And when you do, you recover more promptly.
That's amazing. What is the difference between living a shallow life and a deep life? What are the benefits of living a deep life, and how can we achieve it?
So let me share with you an example to illustrate this principle of the difference between shallow and deep. So I spoke about the SPIRE model: spiritual, physical, intellectual, relational, and emotional. Let's take intellectual well-being, learning. Most of what people learn today is shallow. So they read the news, but then, they really only read the headlines. Or Or the tweet. Or the tweet, exactly. So it's the short messages, the short, texts.
Yeah.
And people no longer or are rarely reading books and rereading these books. 200 years ago, our great-great-great-grandparents would read, for example, the Bible. And they would read it time and time again. And every week when they went to, the house of worship, again, they would read it and they would also learn lessons about it. This is deep learning. And it could apply to the Bible, and it could apply to Aristotle's work, and it could apply to work by Lao Tzu. It doesn't matter. But people read deeply. Today, it's all on the surface. That's why we surf the web. That's why we scan the material. That's why we browse. We no longer go deep. And we pay a very high price for it. Why? Because our brain functions in the way that if we don't use something, we lose something. And if we don't use the deep muscles or the deep neural pathways in our brain, we lose it. And then it doesn't just apply to our inability to concentrate on a book. It also applies to our inability to concentrate on a relationship. Yes. Because if we constantly need new stimulations, a new text or a new page or a new idea, we'll also constantly need new stimulations in terms of our relationship. Whereas if we learn a book, a text, or a work of art, or a piece of music in depth, we're exercising those deep muscles, those neural pathways. And then we'll also be able to go in much more depth into our relationships and to really know the other, to really understand, to find excitement and joy and love in the deep rather than in the shallow. So it applies to every area. It also applies to the area of food. Are we all about, fast food? Are we all about quick fixes? Or do we go deep? There is a wonderful book by one of my favorite authors called In Praise of Slowness. In Praise of Slowness by Carl Honore. And he talks about how we need to shift our culture from, quick fixes, quick solutions, instant gratification.
The hack. That word everybody uses nowadays.
Move it to more deep, slowly, gently, deeply. And that applies to how and what we eat. That applies to our relationships. It applies to our love life.
Yeah.
It also applies to how and what we read and watch and listen to.
That's amazing. And you made an exercise. You show us a paint, and you started to ask people, what do you feel? What do you see in this painting? And people started saying the words. And you tell us then, use those words to begin a conversation. And it's a really different conversation. If you take a painting and people say resilience, hope, believing in higher selves. And it was amazing, the example, so that we can search for a more deep connection with others, when you have these kind of words or concepts in our conversation. It was amazing.
You know, my family came for a vacation in Mexico City. And of course, Mexico City is the city that has the second highest number of museums in the world.
Wow, yes.
And, you know, I remember going with my kids and my wife to a museum, and I told them, okay, just stand in front of this painting, of this work, and just observe it. No need to talk, just reflect on it. What is it saying to you? You know, this is a practice I learned from one of my colleagues, James Pawelski. And once you stand in front of a work of art and listen to it, listen to its voice, you can learn so much about yourself and about life, and so much more than just glancing through, 100 images in a magazine. And I'm not against magazines, and I'm not against fast food, and I'm not against shallow living once in a while, if it's in conjunction with, in addition to, deeply living.
Absolutely. That's amazing. Tal, how can we cultivate a sense of meaning in our lives?
So, first of all, meaning, of course, is a very important part of happiness. You know, when I talk about spiritual well-being, it's about finding a sense of meaning and purpose in life. That's how we generate spirituality. So how do you do it? Let me share with you a study that was conducted by Adam Grant. And what he did was he went to individuals whose job was to raise money for their university. So every day for hours, they get on the phone and they call people to ask for money. Now you can imagine what is the word that they hear most often.
Of course.
No.
No.
Sometimes if they are lucky, it's no thank you. Other times it's no, leave me alone.
Yes.
I'm busy. And that's what they do day in and day out. Very demanding work. So what Adam Grant did was divide these fundraisers into two groups. One group, they go on business as usual. The other group, he took them out of their workplace for 15 minutes. During those 15 minutes, he introduced them to one of the students at the university who was on financial aid.
Oh.
In other words, a student who was there thanks to the work that they are doing, raising money. And the conversation was around the student expressing gratitude, saying, thank you for doing what you're doing, because of what you're doing, I'm able to have such an incredible experience. And they told them what they do at the university and all that they're getting out of that experience. For 15 minutes, they thanked them. And then they went back to their work, raising money. Few things happened. As a result of that 15 minutes, over the next month, their job satisfaction went up significantly. As a result of those 15 minutes, meaning and purpose scores skyrocketed. As a result of those 15 minutes, over the next month, they raised between 250 and 400% more money.
Wow.
Because they connected to purpose.
Yes.
So this is what we can do and encourage, of course, our employees and our children to do day in and day out, to connect to purpose. What is it in what you're doing that is making a difference? And it is. We just need to identify what that is and remind ourselves of it. And when we do, we connect to meaning, we connect to purpose. Often in the workplace, we're asked to write our job description. So an exercise that I do with my clients is I ask them to write not their job description, but rather their calling description. In other words, the question is, what is it in your work that is meaningful, that provides you with a sense of calling? Focus on that and remind yourself consistently of why you do what you do and why what you do matters.
That's amazing, because you can find your purpose in what you are doing, because there's a concept that the purpose, we have to find it otherwhere else, in a different place. Like, I haven't You listen to this kind of complaints like, I haven't found the purpose of my life. I should be doing something different.
That's right. So we can usually find purpose in just about everything that we do. The question is a question of focus. And it's so often a question of focus. You can walk outside in your street, the same street that you walk every day, and one day it looks, ugly and boring. And the other day you focus on a tree that's been there all along. And you look at how the leaves interact with each other. And you hear it. And then you see maybe a flower. And then it's so different because you are focusing on it. So much of life is about what we choose to focus on.
Yes, absolutely. You know that I asked you this 2 days ago, but I want to ask you it again because I love the answer and I think it's very useful. How can individuals find their purpose and become happier by first focusing on helping themselves before helping others?
There is a very clear distinction in our culture today between helping yourself and helping others.
Yeah.
And we have words for it. And a person who thinks about her or himself, a person who helps themselves, is selfish. Whereas a person who helps others, who contributes to others, is selfless. And this distinction is an unhealthy distinction. Why? Because self and others are connected. And what we know today is that if I help myself, if I contribute to my happiness, I actually become more generous. I become kinder. I'm much more inclined to help others. And then, if I help others, if I contribute to others, I'm also helping myself because I feel better. So, rather than being selfish or selfless, what we ought to think about is how can we become self-full? And to be self-full means to think about our needs and, not or, and to think about how we contribute to others' needs. And then what we do is we create an upward cycle where I help myself, and then as a result of helping myself, I become more generous and kinder, and I help others. And when I help others, I actually become happier. I'm helping myself, and when I help myself, I have more desire and ability to help others. So that's how you create an upward spiral of generosity. And these are the spirals that we need in our society. Upward spirals of generosity and kindness and giving to ourselves and giving to others, being selfful.
What can people do to maintain hope and act positively when external circumstances like conflicts or regimes seem beyond their control?
For me, the guiding principle when I think about what I ought to do with my life is the environmentalist movement's mantra, which is think global, act local. Yes, of course, we want to be aware of what's going on around the world. We don't want to bury our head in the sand and ignore it. But at the same time, if all I'm thinking about what is going on in the world, what I experience is helplessness. And helplessness then leads to depression and to doing nothing. So the environmentalists, when they talk about think global, act local, they question that is asked, there is, what can I do in my immediate vicinity? How can I change my nears and dears? How can I affect the circumstances around me? And then I always think about a sentence that I was raised with, that my parents often repeated to me, which is a sentence taken from the Talmud. And that is, he who has saved one life, it's as if he has saved the entire world. In other words, even if you make a difference in the life of one person, an employee, a child, your best friend, you have made a significant difference. And what that does, having this mindset of focusing on the local, that empowers us. Because the difference between sadness and depression is that depression is sadness without hope.
Hago una pausa en esta conversación porque llevo tiempo usando mis productos de Paleo Life y cuando algo me funciona, yo lo comparto. Porque vamos a ser honestas, ¿quién no quiere más energía? O dormir bien o simplemente tener un sistema inmunológico fuerte. Ahí es donde entran los suplementos de Paleo Life. Empecemos con el magnesio, que es una maravilla para el cuerpo porque no solamente te ayuda a dormir mejor, relajando el sistema nervioso para que realmente descanses, sino que también es clave para evitar calambres y mejorar tu recuperación muscular. Así que si eres de los que se despierta en la madrugada con la pierna tiesa, créeme que esto te va a cambiar la vida. Luego está el C-Max, un antioxidante poderoso que ayuda a reducir la inflamación y a mejorar la movilidad, algo que todos necesitamos, especialmente si tienes rigidez en las articulaciones o molestias después del ejercicio. Y por supuesto, no puedo dejar de hablar del glutatión, un antioxidante maestro. Este es clave para fortalecer tu sistema inmunológico y ayudarte a desintoxicar el cuerpo de metales pesados y toxinas. Básicamente le da como un reset a tu organismo y lo protege del daño celular. Así que si quieres experimentar estos beneficios en tu cuerpo y sentirte mejor de adentro hacia afuera, date una oportunidad con los suplementos de Paleo Life. Haz clic en el link que te dejo en la descripción de este espacio y utiliza el código Erika para que tengas un descuento adicional. Aprovecha y empieza a cuidarte como te mereces con los productos de Paleo Life.
And how do we switch from feeling hopeless to hopeful? It's by switching from feeling helpless to becoming helpful. So if I can be helpful, contribute in some small way, that immediately shifts me away from helplessness and away from hopelessness. Think global, act local.
Yeah. Are you a happy person?
So,
how do you describe yourself?
It's a difficult question to answer, and here is why. Because I don't think there is a point before which we're unhappy, and once we go past that point, we suddenly become happy. In other words, it's not a binary 0-1. Rather, happiness exists on a continuum. And I can certainly say that today I'm happier than I was 30 years ago when I started my journey. At the same time, I certainly hope that 5 years from now, I'll be happier than I am today. So the right way, I think, to think about it is not so much am I happy or not, but how can I become happier?
So you just said that this is a continuum. So thinking about that, I can think that you are still learning about yourself.
Very much so, and I will hopefully be learning about myself until the day I die.
What was the last thing you learned about yourself lately?
So I've been thinking a lot lately about the idea of expectations. I remember learning already in introduction to psychology about how important expectations were. And, having high expectations leads to more success, whether it's having high expectations of yourself or high expectations of your children or students, they become self-fulfilling prophecy. And I still believe that. I think having high expectations is a very important part of success, individual success, organizational success. However, if we want to make the most of expectations, we need to have a more nuanced understanding of it. For example, if my expectations are that after I learn about the science of happiness, I'll be happy all the time, well, these are false expectations. And they'll actually make me less happy. If I go into a relationship, a romantic relationship, and I think that we're going to live happily ever after, just like they do in the movies, then these are unrealistic expectations that are actually going to make our relationship worse Because when we face the first barrier, and there are inevitably barriers and challenges and hardships, I'm just going to be thinking, okay, so what's wrong? This is not working. Instead of understanding that this is part of reality. So having realistic expectations is actually more important than merely having high expectations. When I started off studying happiness, I actually thought that I would find the secret to the happily ever after, whether it's in my personal life, my professional life. I realized that I will never find it. That a happy life is also a life that includes hardships and difficulties and challenges. And that's part of parcel of every life, especially a full and fulfilling life.
That's amazing. How can we feel hope, Tal? Somebody that is listening this moment or watching us, what are 3 things that anybody can do to start to feel hope in their life? Because maybe it's difficult nowadays, or that's the belief.
Yeah. So there is research by Michel Guillan showing that 8 minutes of news a day negatively affects our mood for the entire day.
Wow.
Now, I'm not saying we should switch off and again live on a mountaintop detached from the world.
Yeah.
That's not the kind of life that most of us would, some of us maybe, but most of us would not go for. But what I am saying is that we need to counter that effect. How? First of all, limit our news consumption, because right now we're consuming way too much.
Yes.
I mean, certainly more than 8 minutes, and for most people it's more than 80 minutes. Limit our consumption. Second, we also need to make sure that we identify the good things that are going on in our life.
Yes.
So a very simple exercise that positive psychologists have been talking about for a long time, and Oprah has been talking about for even longer, is to keep a gratitude journal. Why is that important? Because it essentially introduces positivity into our neural pathways, into our brains, into our minds. Eknath Iswaran, who was a student of Gandhi and a world-renowned professor and teacher, said the following. He said, "We become what we meditate on." What he meant is that we become what we repeatedly go over again and again. Now, if we repeatedly consume bad news, we become negative.
Yeah.
But if we meditate on, if we repeatedly consume appreciation, great music, meaningful works of art, good books, high quality relationships and interactions, we become what we meditate on. So we simply need to change the ratio and ingest more quality, more positivity, more goodness.
And that's the way that we can maintain the change in our lives. But because one thing is to have the mindset to change our lives to a better life. And the other thing is, how do I apply the concept in my life?
What's essential in order to apply the concept into our lives is repetitive, ongoing action. You know, I talk about the 3 R's of change, which are reminders. We need to remind ourselves, what kind of life do we want to live? We need to do it repetitively, over and over again, so that we get to the 3rd R. After reminders and repetition, we have rituals. You know, you don't need anyone to remind you to brush your teeth every day. It's a ritual. It's automatic. And in the same way, we need to create rituals out of expressing gratitude. So first of all, remind yourself to keep a gratitude journal. Do it day in and day out so that it becomes part of your life, just like brushing your teeth is a part of your life. Be kind, generous to others as a ritual.
Yes.
First, remind yourself to do it, then do it again and again until it becomes second nature. So the first thing that I would recommend to create a more hopeful life is consume more hopeful content. Second, and this is something that works like a charm, because it really is, and it's considered, in fact, by many psychiatrists to be the wonder drug of psychology, and that is exercise.
Wow, it's incredible.
So I cannot overemphasize how important exercise is. You know, I'm not a psychotherapist. I don't work with people one-on-one. But if I were a psychotherapist, the first question that I would ask when meeting a client, well, maybe the second question, because the first question would be, what's your name? But the second question would be, do you exercise regularly? Because if the answer is no, I would say to them, that's the first thing you need to start doing. Because the impact of exercise is identical to our most powerful psychiatric medications, releasing the exact same chemicals, norepinephrine, serotonin, dopamine. These are the feel-good chemicals in our brain. So exercising, and he does it without side effects, or rather positive side effects.
Yes.
You don't just feel better, you look better, you think better, more clearly, you become a nicer person to be around. It has all these remarkable, you sleep better, it has all these remarkable benefits. So exercising very often, you know, before COVID and before the war in Ukraine, in the Middle East, when the world was a little bit more sane, I would exercise 3 times a week, regularly, rain or shine. Because I know the research, and the research shows that that's the minimum that you need. 3 times a week, 30 minutes at least each time is good enough. Since COVID, it's up to 6 times a week.
Wow.
Because I actually feel that I need more of it to remain hopeful, to sustain happiness levels, to deal with the negative environment. So that's the second thing that I would do. The third thing, number one predictor of happiness, quality time we spend with people we care about and who care about us. And in person.
Oh, that's
critical.
So important.
Yeah,
yes.
I'm not against social media, and I think it's great because we get to keep up with other people. We get to share what we do, which is wonderful. However, not as a substitute for one-on-one or small group interactions where we spend time together.
Yeah.
In other words, it's about going back to basics.
Back to basics.
You know, it's the appreciate rather than take for granted. It's be physically active, and it's spend time with your loved ones.
And that is nothing that AI can do for you.
Unfortunately not. I wish.
So if somebody's listening to us, Tal, and want to study about happiness, talk about the Happiness Study Academy and how it works, because it's very interesting, and maybe people make the decision to study.
So I'm the co-founder of the Happiness Studies Academy, which is where I spend most of my waking hours, and even sometimes when I sleep, I dream about it.
Yes.
And what we offer are certificate programs, and we offer the world's first master's degree in happiness studies. And soon we're launching the world's first PhD in happiness studies, because our goal is, first of all, to help our students become happier. Second, to help them help others become happier. And to do it in a way that relies on research, on evidence. So introducing tips, techniques, and ideas that actually work, that actually make a difference in people's lives.
So the registration is open. They can start in any time of the year?
Yes. So we open a certificate program 3 times a year.
3 times a year.
And we have students from all over the world, from Latin America,
in any
from
language.
Asia. And it's translated into Spanish, into Portuguese, into Chinese, and a few other languages.
That's amazing, Tal. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Erika, and thank you for all the work that you do and for the joy and happiness that you bring to our world.
Well, I'm learning how to be happy and hopeful, to show others to be responsible of their own happiness. I think that's the message I want to give people. Like, don't give that responsibility to other person or the circumstances. It's all about us.
Erika, can I share a story with you about responsibility? So, one of my teachers and mentors was Nathaniel Branden. He passed away a few years ago. Nathaniel Branden wrote a wonderful book, which I highly, highly recommend, called The 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem, where he talks about the 6 key elements to high self-esteem. And one of those key elements is taking responsibility. And he talks about how if you want to fulfill your potential for self-esteem, you have to take responsibility for your life. And he uses a metaphor where he says you need to accept the fact that no one is coming.
No one is coming.
No one, knight in shining armor, or the princess bride, or the president or mayor or leader who's going to change life for the better. It's up to you and you alone to take responsibility for your life and to make the most of it. No one is coming. So he was teaching this in one of his workshops, and it was a 3-day-long workshop. And on the 3rd day, towards the end, one of the participants puts his hand up, and Dr. Branden calls him and says yes. And it was a young man who says, Dr. Branden, I understand what you mean by the importance of taking responsibility. I even understand what you're talking about when you say that no one is coming. But Dr. Branden, I disagree with you. So Nathaniel Branden asks him, what do you mean you disagree with me? And he says, well, Dr. Branden, it's not true that no one is coming because you came. And Nathaniel Branden thinks for a few seconds, and then he says, young man, you're right. I came. But I came to tell you that no one is coming.
So funny.
And this is such an important message.
It is.
Because really the first step to becoming happier and to helping others become happier is to understand that it's your responsibility. And what can I do today, right now, to make my world, our world, a better place? And that's a good place to start and to generate and to bring about real impact, real change.
Does happiness has to be with age?
It's an interesting question because in general, we do become happier as we grow older. And the interesting research question was, why? What is it about aging that actually contributes to happiness? Because we know there are many things that are taken away from us as we age, and yet we become happier. And the answer lies, to a great extent, in perspective. Meaning, when something bad happens to us when we're younger, it sometimes seems like it's the end of the world. Whereas as we age, we understand it's probably temporary and it will pass. And tomorrow will be a better day than today or yesterday was. We also become more accepting of our imperfections, more accepting of ourselves, more accepting of painful experiences. We accept them as part of life, rather than amplify them or see them as a tragedy or the end of the world. And when we're more accepting of ourselves, of our lives, and of others, we actually become a lot happier.
I want to end this conversation with a mantra that I repeat everywhere I go and to people around me, that I heard you say, that is, the things doesn't happen for better. Can you finish the line?
So, I grew up hearing this sentence over and over again when people would say, oh, things happen for the best.
For the best.
And I must say, I never really connected to it. What do you mean things happen for the best? The war in Ukraine or the Middle East for the best? I mean, people are dying every day. Or COVID for the best? People lost their lives, their loved ones as a result of it. But while I do not believe that things happen for the best, I know that we can make the best of things that happen. Difficult things that we didn't invite into our lives happen. The question is, what do we do when they happen? What do we learn from them? How do we grow from them? How can we become more caring, empathic, and kind when we go through these hardships? So while things don't happen for the best, at every moment in our life, we have a choice to make the best of things that happen.
Oh, I love it. Thank you, Tal, for being here in the podcast. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Erika.
Tal Ben-Shahar en Defensa Propia. Este episodio fue presentado por el Guitar Hotel de Seminole Hard Rock. Paleolife, productos naturales, efectivos y respaldados por la ciencia. Este episodio fue posible gracias al Rental MX y a la Academia de los Estudios de la Felicidad de Tal Ben-Shahar. En Defensa Propia es producido con el apoyo de Andrea Wallis y editado por Vanessa Ferrebus y Jesús Acosta, con música original de Para Rayos Estudios. Yo soy Erika de la Vega y recuerda que esto lo hacemos en Defensa Propia.